Hi, everybody. So rather than taking a week off because we have reading week in Canada, where I'm a professor, I booked back to back to back to back talks. But when I have guests like these two lovely ladies, I think I'm doing the right thing. So let me introduce them to you. We've got Bethany Mandel and Karol Markowicz. Karol is her second time appearance. So Bethany is a columnist for Fox News and a contributing writer for Deseret. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yep.
News, editor of the children's book series Heroes of Liberty, named one of the 50 Jews everyone should follow on Twitter in 2019 by the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. Now, from a self-absorbed perspective, was Gad Saad on that list at number one, and was Karol on that list?
I wasn't, no.
You weren't?
No.
Was
No.
I?
It helps when you're friends with the person who's compiling that list, just for future reference.
Okay, well, if I wasn't on the 2019, please correct that egregious error.
Yeah.
All right. So then you've written for the New York Times, New York Post, Washington Post, Washington Examiner, Newsweek, and others. Karol was my guest on the Saad Truth 1455 episode, which was around September. Weekly columnist at the New York Post and Fox News, has written for USA Today, Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Time, National Review, among other outlets. And you are both the co-author of a forthcoming book to be out next week, March 7th, Stolen Youth, How Radicals Are Erasing Innocence and Indoctrinating a Generation. Did I cover all the key points? Are we good?
The only thing is that the interview comes out the 7th, so.
Oh, the interview comes out the 7th. True. And the book comes out on the 7th.
Yeah.
No worries. Very, very excited to speak to you both. Why don't we start off with the general theme of the book? I think one of the things that, Karol, you reminded me that we should probably discuss is that at the start of your book about children indoctrination, you do kind of a historical perspective of how other societies and other regimes have exactly applied the indoctrination template on children. Maybe we could start off there.
Yeah. So I wrote that chapter. We switched back and forth on the chapters, and I drew from my own background, being born in the Soviet Union and hearing the stories growing up about how you couldn't say certain things, and you couldn't, you couldn't say certain things. You had to say the right things strongly enough. If you didn't say them strongly enough, you could really get into trouble. And throughout COVID, we watched this happen in the Western world, where there was the correct opinion, and that was the only opinion allowed. And so, for example, on the lab leak, which we now know, and we've known for a while that the COVID came from a lab, but that was an opinion that you could be banned from social media for saying. And you could be, you'd be called a kook, and you might be fired from your job. And people have been fired for far less during the COVID years. So we watched it come to our shores in a really scary way. A few days ago, I was in the car with my kids. I have a daughter who's 13 and sons who are 10 and 7. And my daughter had just gotten her nails done. And my 7-year-old sort of just playfully said, can I get my nails done? And I said, no, in our house, we have really strict gender stereotypes that we follow. And my 13-year-old daughter said to my 7-year-old, don't say that outside the house. She just didn't want him to repeat that at school and get in trouble or whatever. And she doesn't know. I mean, she does know, but being a conservative writer means that I don't care about being canceled. I don't care about being targeted, because I'm used to it, and because there's only so much that these people could do to me. But it was concerning to me that my daughter had gotten a lesson that you can't say certain things outside of our home. And parents are seeing that throughout the country in so many different ways.
What was the original? Again, either of you can take the questions, or one can build on the response of the other. What was sort of the impetus that led you each, maybe independently of one another, and then to come together to say, I need to weigh in on this. I think there's a book to be written here about how children are being indoctrinated. What was there such a sort of episodic moment?
Yeah, so we sort of knew we wanted to write a book together. We knew that society at large was sort of trying to interfere with our parenting choices. And the original book title that we were thinking of was Get Your Village Off My Children. And we decided to open a Google Doc and just dump stories in of like, this happened, this happened, this happened, think pieces that were sort of more general. And we realized after a week, like the question went from, is there enough here for a book, to how can we possibly write a book and how can we wrap our brains around this? Because there was just so much material. And what was really frustrating, of course, is, after you finish the book, you're like, oh, I wish that I had read,
Yeah.
I wish I had said this, I wish I'd put this in. And I like have to stop reading it now because I'm just so frustrated. Like there's one sentence that is haunting me until the day I die. I wish I had put it in there. But there's so much out there that are unfortunate examples of how this sort of worldview is trying to take hold of an entire generation of children that are not their own. They're not the ones having kids. We are.
Yeah.
And they've decided that it is their sacred duty to make sure that they are being raised with a woke worldview that does not come from their parents.
By they and we, you mean that on average, the fertility rate of progressives is, correct me if I'm wrong, it's probably below the replacement rate of 2.17. Is that true?
Yeah, it's in the tank. If you superimpose sort of fertility rates by state and then by voting patterns, you can see a very clear pattern of the coastal states, the states that vote left, generally speaking, have much lower fertility rates than those of more conservative states. And the same with religious affiliation as well. If you look at religious affiliation and birth rate versus non-religious affiliation, and those generally tend to sort of trend one way or the other, ideologically, politically.
So I'm going to propose a speculative hypothesis here and to get to kind of because I want to link something that I discuss in my forthcoming book about the difference in happiness scores between conservatives and liberals, and then link it to this fertility finding that you just spoke of. So in the book, I demonstrate that, while the results are not absolutely unequivocal, there certainly does seem to be a happiness effect such that conservatives score higher on happiness, well-being, and so on than liberals. And I don't think the literature has nailed down what might be the explanation for that finding. And so what I proposed, and then we can link it to the fertility finding. So I argued that, when you're a progressive, utopia is around the corner, right? We need to dismantle the world as it is today. It sucks. And then if only we can implement the right system, the true socialism, the true pure, utopia, then everybody would be happy. So when I wake up as a progressive, I'm by definition existentially unhappy with the status quo because happiness is around the corner. Whereas if I'm a conservative, the word means there are certain values and principles worth conserving. So I wake up existentially pleased with the status quo. And I argue that might be a key defining factor that explains the difference between conservatives and liberals. And then, of course, if that holds, then it makes sense that if I am a unhappy progressive, I don't want to bring people into the miserable world that we live in because we haven't reached nirvana yet. Does the whole story make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree. The exercise of having children is an expression of hope in the future. I would never bring children into this world that I thought was doomed for, fire and brimstone with whatever sort of thing is going on that week that, will end society, whether it be COVID or climate change, whatever. But I'm not particularly worried about any of those things. I have hope in the future. And a lot of that is because I'm religious. Right. So, when you believe in God, you trust that things will all just work out. But yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think that all of those things are intertwined. And, if I'm going to choose a worldview, I'm just glad to have the one that makes me happy.
Now, so
not so stressed out.
You don't buy occasional Cortex's position that we have 12 minutes or 12 days or whatever the number is left to live. I mean, what kind of monster must you be to have produced, I think, 6 kids, right? One of you has 3, one has 6. Yeah. You guys must be incredibly selfish pigs to produce children that are not going to see their reproductive window instantiated. We have 12 years left, no?
Right. So it's funny because I tell my own kids when they get fed this idea in school, especially when we lived in Brooklyn, that the world's going to end very soon and you should be out there protesting. But I say to them, like, look at the people saying this and then look at their lives. Al Gore's house is like 12 times or something the footprint of the average American house. Leonardo DiCaprio, big environmental activist, is like frequently taking, his yacht out by himself. They fly private. They don't live, like, if I were genuinely afraid of the climate destroying us all, I would change my life. I would live very differently. And yet they say that they're very concerned about this, but they don't act very concerned. And that's a big tell for me. I'm a poker player. That's a tell.
Yeah. And also they're not building bunkers. I would not be having the waterfront property that all of these people have.
Right.
Indeed.
I'd be building down.
The sole question that will be targeted specifically to one of you two. So I know that Bethany, your all of your kids are homeschooled.
Yeah.
Was this something that came out of the realization that they were being indoctrinated, or would you have homeschooled them even if none of the parasitic ideas were floating around?
So it's a good question, and it's a very big life choice, and I can't sort of peg it to one sort of thing. We're Jewish, and so the traditional model for people in our community, literally 99.9% of people send to Jewish day schools. And so, we don't have an extra 30K per kid per year. And we wanted to have more than 2 kids. And so it was a choice of limit our family size or make other educational decisions. And then, there are people who send public, and I did not want to do that. Because of the indoctrination. We lived, and we still live, we moved from one deep blue area to another where I'm not smart like Karol and picked up my family and moved to a red state. We moved from deep blue New Jersey to deep blue Maryland. And I did not want my kids in those schools. And things were not even crazy back when we made the decision to homeschool. They were still sort of like ramping up a little bit. With the fear mongering with climate change, and the gender stuff wasn't really on the radar of young children yet. And that's sort of the heart of why we wrote this book, was that, there's so much written about sort of the wokeization of corporate America, of colleges, but there's very little in the way of children, and people weren't paying attention to what how children were being targeted. And they've just pressed the gas. And it was sort of a weird decision to start with. We didn't start with COVID, but we definitely have a lot of COVID in here. And for us, it was just like, this is when they pressed on the gas.
Right.
And they decided, like, this was a test experiment. Let's see how much they'll swallow and how quiet they'll be when the emperor has no clothes. And everyone dutifully put on those cloth masks outside for a year and a half. So let's do it up.
One more follow-up to Bethany, then I'll open it up again to either of you. Do you worry, as someone who's made the decision to homeschool your kids, that, okay, notwithstanding all the indoctrination, that there are some developmental markers that they might miss out on by virtue of them being homeschooled, right? There is value in, I know that, for example, I have a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old, and just developmentally, as would be exactly, you could set your watch to it. There comes a period where they're a lot more interested in speaking to their peers than they are in speaking to you. I go from hero, not quite hopefully to a 0, but I'm clearly not as vivid in the day-to-day moments of my daughter's life, who's now 14. So do you worry that in some capacity they're losing out by not being able to experience some of that social reality?
Yeah. So I wish that I could bring up the 14-year-old homeschool girl that's currently babysitting my other children in my basement so she could take this question. I'll talk about her because I don't have a 14-year-old yet. She is brilliant and responsible and the most capable 14-year-old you'll ever meet in your life. And a lot of it is by virtue of she's around people of all different ages, from adults with her parents, on a much more sort of closer ratio, to her little siblings, to my children. And she has a sense of responsibility and a sense of maturity that children of her age in school don't have. When you think about the school environment, it's super artificial. We've decided that socialization is this very narrow thing where you're sitting in a classroom for 8 hours a day, which sometimes you're allowed to talk, most of the time you're not allowed to talk, to people born within a calendar year of you. And that's not reality. Most of my friends, I would say one of them are within a year of me. Everyone else is 5-10 years older on either side. And this homeschool girl in my basement, she has tons of social opportunities, and so do my children. I'm literally going to leave this call and run out the door to bring my kids to a Taekwondo class. They do art classes, they do music classes. There's so many social opportunities for homeschooled kids. But I'll also sort of turn, one of my favorite things is the lack of socialization. I don't think it's a lack, it's just a different kind of socialization. But the lack of traditional socialization in schools is a feature and not a bug of homeschooling. I don't want my children necessarily to form relationships with every kid who was born within a calendar year of them in our neighborhood. There's some kids I don't really like, and I can say that. And so I'm able to be a little bit more picky and choosy with my kids' friends because I have a lot more, I don't want to say control because it makes me seem like very controlly, but I have a lot more input on my kids' socialization. And that peer influence is really powerful. And there is a developmental shift at around that age where they are sort of considering the thoughts of their peers more than their parents. And you want to make sure that those are good peers.
Yeah. I mean, we're kind of struggling and navigating through all these. How old are your children, Karol, again? Can you remind us?
So 13, 10, and 7.
The 13 is a boy or
a girl.
A girl?
Yeah.
So are you getting the eye rolls and the rest of it?
No, she's really earnest and sweet. She's a little sarcastic, but
I wonder where she gets that from.
That's that's always been the case. She's also very responsible. So I get that the homeschool model maybe produces kids who are more responsible, but I happen to have maybe lucked out, and my daughter is. My son's less. Not sure, when I sent my middle son to sleepaway camp, I'm not sure he brushed his hair or anything, even one time. But yeah, kids are all different. And so far, I also have, I feel like a pretty good control over her social group and over my son's social group as well. And she trusts my opinion. I mean, that might not always be the case, but when I'm like, that person, she's like, yeah, you're right. That person's not.
Oh, that's great. That's wonderful.
So far.
So in setting up now some of the discussion of the meat of the book, Stolen Youth, get out and pick it up. March 7th, it will be released. I wanted to share with you something that I discuss in one of my lectures in my consumer behavior course, where I'm discussing with the students, is it ever ethical to advertise to children? But in this case, by advertisement, we mean cereals and bubble gum and so on. And if it is okay to advertise to children, what should be the framework under which we are able to decide at what age it would be appropriate to do so? And the answer, roughly speaking, is it really comes again from this idea that there are certain developmental stages that children hit in a very predictable way, such that you should never be able to advertise to children if they haven't yet reached the cognitive developmental stage to know that the advertisement is a persuasive attempt, right? So because if I know that there is that persuasive attempt, then I can build up my cognitive and emotional defenses against it. I could start thinking about a counter argument for why I shouldn't buy Mazda and Mazda, whatever it is. But I've got the if you like, not an inoculation, but as I said, a possibility to counter argue your persuasive intent. And so people place that at different stages, but for the sake of our discussion, let's say it's 9. Some countries it's 10, some countries it's 13, whatever. But there is a clear recognition that it is unethical, if not immoral, to target children when you're doing something as innocuous as trying to sell them chewing gum. So put that in context, and now we have folks who are trying to enter our children's brains to teach them about transgender issues and sexual issues at a much younger age than 9 and 10. So it's a lot deeper issue than selling chewing gum or drag queens twerking during reading hour. So how could the progressives reconcile those two different realities, the one that I first shared regarding consumer psychology and the indoctrination? Is there any logic to what they're doing?
So I would say, it's funny, so I have 3 kids. My middle son is so susceptible to advertising. He just today sent me that Lucky Charms has a St. Patrick's Day cereal, and can I buy it? And I'm like, no, I cannot. So first of all, I think kids will get targeted via advertising, no matter what. I think out in the world, they will be targeted by images. And he is so just, this is going to be amazing. And then he gets it and it's like, this is not that great. But it's funny because my other two really aren't. And especially my daughter, during COVID, she recognized that the commercials were like, we're all in this together, buy our car. And she started mocking it. She sort of saw that it was like, we believe, buy our product. And she started just making fun of it. So first of all, I would say that that's a way to inoculate your children as much as possible. Again, my middle son is kind of lost to this, but as much as possible, teach them how hilarious and, the ridiculous these commercials actually are, and how the product will never, be this amazing thing that they want. And the same thing goes for the information provided to you at school. You have to look at it, or anywhere in the world, you have to look at it critically and say, is this an opinion? Is this a fact? Do I believe this? Do I not? Do I speak up against this? Or does this not matter to me? And that sort of lays the foundation for these kids as they head to adulthood. Resiliency is a chapter in our book, and that's a really important part of raising your children. So you can't buy them the Lucky Charms every time, and you can't just let them have, unfettered access to all kinds of things on the internet, and you can't let people influence your kids without your say so.
Right. What bothers me, and then you can respond if you like, Bethany, but what bothers me about a lot of these progressive positions is just how internally inconsistent they are, just from an logic axiomatic perspective, right? So for example, you can't, if you're 17 years old, 364 days old, so meaning that in one day you'll be an adult, and you put out a premeditated hit on your parents to pick up the insurance, well, the progressives will be the first to jump and say, hey, but this is just a child. Their prefrontal cortex have not yet developed. They'll only develop when they're 25. So we can't punish this person who put out a hit on their parents to gain the money, because they're one day short of being an adult. They're a child. But that's from this side of the mouth. From this side of the mouth, oh, they're 3 years old and they've just declared that they are transgender. You have to believe. So from this side, they're too young at 17, 364. From this side, they're that's the kind of stuff that pisses me off. As someone who studied, psychology of decision-making and rational choice, a lot of these progressive tenets are not internally consistent. And any of you can take it.
Yeah, so that's funny. We had this exact situation in Maryland. We had two bills that were up at the legislature at the exact same time. One of them was to lower the age of consent for immunizations. It's the COVID shot. That's why they did it. And they wanted to lower it to 12, but in some circumstances, even as low as 8. So that was one bill. Another bill said that people under 18 were not, the prefrontal cortex, the whole yada yada, that they weren't able to make rational decisions for carjackings. So they should not be held, they should not be charged as adults when they're carjacking. One of those passed and one of those was pulled. The immunizations one was pulled, and it was because so many people were like, pick one. They're either able to make decisions or they're not. And so they decided that they were going to say that children are not able to make decisions. Guess how many cars have been hijacked in my neighborhood in the last week? Turns out these things have consequences.
Right. Wow, that's
all
great.
Teenagers.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And kids, you're not allowed to smoke in America until you're 21, but you can get a sex change at 18, and some places even younger. It is just so, and you can join the military obviously at 18, but you can't gamble in Las Vegas until you're 21, and all of these things they don't make sense, and they do seem to just be catered to whatever interest group is pushing the idea.
Amazing.
Yeah. And by the way, the effort to defeat that vaccination bill was only because they felt like they were put on the fence so much with that carjacking bill, basically in the same legislative session. And so when enough people called them out on the inconsistency, that was when they pulled the vaccination bill. So,
well, this idea of putting them on the fence, I mean, is part of parental activism. So I'm going to now link some of the parental activism that has come out, say from pushing against CRT or the transgender stuff and so on, and link it I don't think it's speculative, but I'm going to propose another theory and get your sense. So my feeling is that we're getting a lot of, I think Asra Nomani, do you know who that is?
Of course, yeah.
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 So Asra, I think she calls herself kind of part of the Mama Bears group,
Mama
right?
bear.
Right. Which I like these animal metaphors. I use, honey badger. Now, here's my evolutionary explanation. To the extent that empirically there are more mothers that are coming out staunchly in defense of their children, and I don't know if that's true, but it seems to certainly be anecdotally that there are more mothers. So even though the human species is referred to as a biparental species officially in biology, but both men and women invest heavily in their children. We're one of the few mammals that are officially classified as a biparental species. It is incontestable that women provide a much greater minimal obligatory parental investment than men do. I mean, certainly just from a gametes perspective, there are about 400 ova that women have from the onset of their menses to menopause, whereas men can have 250 million spermatozoa in a single ejaculation. So one is scarce and cheap, one is scarce and costly, one is cheap and abundant. Hence microeconomic theory, we know how that would tilt. So it makes perfect evolutionary sense to me that the sex, the parental sex that would be leading the defense of their children would be mothers. So from all of the anecdotes that you've picked up, you may not have formal data. Do you get the sense that many of the leaders of these parental revolt movements are led by mothers more so than fathers?
Overall, yes. There was the case in Loudoun County, and I'll let Bethany speak to it, where a father told the story of his daughter being raped by somebody in a. So there are dads who are involved, but yes, I think what happened is moms. I mean, not to over exaggerate, but yes, moms are definitely more involved with children overall, and I think they saw during the pandemic over their kids' shoulder what was happening in schools, and that was the moment for them where they realized they had to do something and they could no longer ignore it. Dads are, I just feel like more. My husband went to a math night at my daughter's school last night, and he said it was majority dads. And that I don't know if that's just because like in our family, I was like, you're going to math night, like make all the relevant plans, and you better do it because I don't have time. Or if the dads were just more interested in the math curriculum. I feel like. Are there differences between what women are interested in and what men are interested in? There are. And like the security and safety of your children, I feel like it is a very mama bear sort of phenomenon where you want to keep them safe at all costs, and you understand what that will entail.
Beautiful. Okay, next one is kind of a broad question. I don't know if, again, you might just have to speculate. So in my last book, in The Parasitic Mind, I identify a whole bunch of these bad ideas, which I call idea pathogens, but then I try to find some commonality. Is there something, there are different cancers, but yet all cancers have one thing in common. It's the unchecked division of cells. So at least that's common to all cancers. So I argued in The Parasitic Mind that what is common to all of these idea pathogens is that they all start with a noble cause, but then it in the service of that original noble cause, you end up murdering truth and raping truth in that service, right? So equity feminism is a great idea. Men and women should be equal under the law. Most people would agree with that. But the radical feminists say, well, that's not enough. We now need to argue that men and women are indistinguishable and there are no biological based differences, because then that would allow us to eradicate the sexist status quo more effectively. And so in the service of that original noble goal, we end up murdering truth. So that was kind of the rubric under which I tried to argue for the commonality of these idea pathogens. So from your perspective, all the various strains of indoctrination, have you thought about what links CRT to transgenderism, to climate anxiety? Is there such a common thread across all these indoctrination viruses?
I'm going to take it. I think there absolutely is. It is leftist political ideology. I would say that there's so much more specific leftism being pushed in all the different facets of our society, in corporations, in licensing colleges, in the teachers' colleges. They get a very leftist education that they then go and spread throughout the country. And it's funny, you said that it kills truth. It also kills people. I mean, the ideologies have that they think that, oh, we're doing something good. I mean, communism, they thought that they were, leading to equality. Equality is amazing, right? Who doesn't think that's great? And then it ended up killing 20 million plus people. So bad ideas have consequences, like, as in the parasitic mind, and it's really important for us to stop those ideas from being targeted to kids specifically, because they are the most susceptible, like we discussed earlier. They're just easier to convince. And once you convince kids, it's much easier to convince their parents.
Right. Do you want to add something, Bethany, before I ask the next
Yeah.
question?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it is this idea that we are inherently flawed in some way, that we are all inherently sexist, racist, obviously, all very racist, but also that that we're so flawed that we might not even we might not have been born with the right brain, with the right gendered brain. And so if you're born as a biological female, maybe you're so messed up that you were born with a male brain instead. And I was just Googling Calvinism, because I think that that's actually the basis of Calvinism, that, we're all born flawed. I might be wrong. That might be the wrong stream of Protestantism. That's not my forte. But I was trying to Google to make sure I didn't make a fool of myself.
Hate mail from the Calvins.
But I mean, I think it's this idea that we are, and sort of hearkening back to our earlier conversation, that, the misery. I don't believe that we are all inherently flawed and need fixing. I think that God, did a pretty good job on the first attempt with all of us, and all of us were born the way that we should have been, even, when we're born a little messed up. That messed up is the point. But their sort of perspective is that everything and everyone needs fixing, and we're always churning and fighting towards this utopia.
Perfect.
And, if you have any understanding of communism, from the very, very beginning to now, you understand that we have just never done communism right. Eventually we'll get there and everything will be great. And the millions and millions of people who have died in Ukraine and China and Cambodia, Cuba, all of those deaths will be for the common good, but that the ends justify the means. And for them, when they're sort of indoctrinating an entire generation of children, and the depression rates are through the roof, anxiety rates are through the roof, everyone is miserable, that's okay, because the ends will justify the means. And I think that that's a big part of our thesis in our book, is that, it sounds very conspiratorial that the end goal of this indoctrination is the misery of an entire generation. But it is, because you can't succeed in fomenting a revolution when everyone's happy. You need everyone to be miserable. And so, make everyone miserable and then enjoy the fruits of that misery when we finally reach utopia. You just have to be super duper miserable before we finally reached our end goal.
There you go. Some solid self-flagellation before you're released into a garden of happiness. So in the intro to your book, I can't remember if it was in the preface, you sort of you give a little passage of the typical kind of email that you receive, or, I wasn't aware of this, and so on, which is, of course, something that I've faced in terms of the emails that I received, millions of times. But oftentimes it's not quite I wasn't aware. It's rather I don't know what my voice can do. I mean, you're some fancy professor with a big platform and you go on Joe Rogan. Well, it makes sense for you to speak, but I'm just some little schmuck. How can I do it? And of course, I always tell people, first of all, we can all do something within our relative spheres of influence. Joe Rogan might have a bigger platform than you. That doesn't mean that you throw up your arms in defeat and diffuse the responsibility onto others. What are some specific, if any, actionable, call to arms that you can provide parents so that they don't either hide under the veil of ignorance, even if it's true. I wasn't aware that this was being taught, or they know that it's true, that that's happening, but who am I? How can I affect the change? Is there a way that we can break through that, light that match, so that people can all in unison act up?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is the most important and why we wrote this book was to just make parents aware that this is what's going on in every sort of facet of their lives. One of my favorite recent stories that I was just told this past weekend from a fellow parent who doesn't work in media, doesn't work in conservative. He's actually very secret at his job because he works in the federal government, and so he can't be known as a conservative. And he was explaining that he led a very quiet revolution in his kids' first grade class against a video that was sort of introducing gender ideology way too early, way too inappropriate for first graders. And how he did it was he just emailed and said, "I'd like to see everything that you're teaching in health class this year. Thank you." And with all of his free time, he has none, he sat down and he just looked through the materials. He got the books out of the library. He watched the videos linked on YouTube. And that was one of the videos that he watched. And he tried to he didn't do it all in one sitting. He tried to keep like 2 weeks ahead or so. And he realized in 2 weeks, they're going to be showing my child this video. I am not comfortable with this. And so he didn't want to pose this problem on the entire class sort of email list. And so, at pickup one day, he said, did you see the video that they're showing the kids in 2 weeks? And the majority of the parents said, "I haven't, but I trust the school. I don't have time for that." And then he got another mom to watch it. And she was like, "That is not okay." And he said, "Well, why don't you tell some of the other class moms?" And the two of them started getting people to watch it. And then 5 people watched it. And then 10 people watched it. And no one was comfortable with it once they finally watched it. And so then they started emailing the principal. And at first the principal said, "We are the experts. We will not be changing the curriculum at the behest of parents." But when in a class of 20, 18 parents have emailed and said, "I'm pulling my kid out," you kind of have to. And so this lesson wasn't just about this video. It was a lesson for the 20 parents in that class who are only in first grade. They got a lot more time in this school. And that classroom of parents learned, I need to be paying closer attention. And when I brought these concerns up initially, the school pushed back. And they thought that they knew better than I did as the parent. And that taught them a lot of lessons that they will carry with them for the next 11 years of their kids' schooling. And so, it's really as easy as that. Just pay attention and talk to your fellow parents, and don't assume that everyone else is comfortable with it. There's this emperor's new clothes moment with woke ideology. Everyone assumes that everyone else is okay with it and that you're the bigot. And it's not the case. And people are just afraid to speak up in a group. But I mean, the video was not appropriate for first graders.
Right. You want to add anything, Karol?
I just to piggyback on that, finding your allies is very important. Finding people of like-mindedness who can speak out together with one voice is important. And that might mean that you have to leave the school that you're at. It might mean that you have to leave your community. It might mean, like I did, you have to leave your state. But you have to make these decisions for your kids, because childhood is very short, and the things that you're doing right now will impact them going forward. I always like to say that the very non-resilient adults, they had to start somewhere, and their parents really didn't do what they were supposed to do for them. It's not going to be easy. That's a thread throughout the book. The book has a lot of fighting in it, how to fight, which way, where to fight, when to fight, because it is going to be a battle. These people have captured most of our institutions, most of our schools, and they are targeting your children. So unless you're okay with that, it's time to fight back.
Well, you may or may not know this, and I think when I sent you some of the questions that I might pose you, one of them was about the schools of education and university, so that if I were to rank all of the different departments on how woke they are, how parasitized they are, undoubtedly the schools of education would probably come on top of that list, if not number one. And I don't think it would be conspiratorial to think that makes perfect sense, because to go back to our earlier point, I need to get access to your children as early as possible in order for them to abide by my, eventual utopian worldview. And therefore, what better way to do that than to indoctrinate the ones who are going to have access to our children, which are elementary school teachers. Do you think that that's something that just happened, organically, or by, for example, a self-selection bias? People who are super progressive decide to become elementary teachers? Or do you think there was kind of a willful, sinister playbook by which we said, let's indoctrinate the teachers so that eventually they can indoctrinate the kids? What's your sense?
I think it was willful, but not quite how you're saying it. I don't think that there was like one, evil guy who was like, we're going to indoctrinate the teachers. It's more conformist. It's more, this is what we believe. If you don't believe that, then maybe this is not the right profession for you. And so what ends up happening is that this leftism is pushed at these teachers' colleges. For example, math is racist is a concept that is in teachers' colleges. It is being taught to teachers that math can potentially be racist, and that you have to look at math as a white supremacy tool. This is not exaggeration. This is actually happening. And I think that that's what limits teachers from fighting back against this. I've met a lot of non-leftist teachers, even in Brooklyn, even in like Park Slope, Brooklyn, like deep, deep blue Brooklyn. I met lots of teachers who are not leftists, but they sort of feel that they have to keep their mouths shut and they have to fit in with the other teachers, especially with their union. They feel like their jobs are at risk if they speak out, but they would send me emails, or they would, tell me like, I like what you're doing, keep fighting. And they would, some of them would do the opposite of, we hear all these stories about these leftist teachers sneaking in indoctrination. These teachers would specifically see the indoctrination in the lesson plans and leave it out. So they are people trying, but the system is so rigged for this wokeness, and there's so much societal pressure to conform that, unless we fix these schools, we're going to continue having this problem. Bethany and I always say, if you think that this is a coastal problem, New York, San Francisco, whatever, look at where the teachers' colleges are and where these teachers disperse to throughout the country. They're in the red communities, they're in the red states, and don't believe for a second that they're not.
Well, this idea, it's only a coastal problem, reminds me of something that I faced early in my career when I first started fighting all the woke stuff before we had the term woke. I've been a professor now 29 years, and I saw this from year one, where there was incredible craziness going on the university campuses. And oftentimes the response that I would get from people is, well, yes, sure, we understand these are crazy ideas, but they are restricted to a few esoteric departments on university campuses. And then my answer was, but those viruses eventually escape.
It's what happens.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, yes, it starts off in sociology and feminist glaciology, but eventually we get out of that. Then, by the way, I just tweeted earlier today a job call from the University of Calgary, a respectable university in Alberta, Canada, about they're looking for an instructor of chemistry, but that is going to use indigenous way of knowing chemistry. And so I tweeted and I said, yes, finally, chemistry will move from being, a fake white science to being a true science informed by indigenous way of knowing, right? Now, to your point about math is racist, not to sort of sit gleefully and say, I told you so. I mean, not you, but the world. In 2016, I released one of my satirical clips where I announced that I had founded a new field, which I called social justice mathematics. I come from a math background, and so I basically went through all of these different theorems and properties of numbers, and I argued how they were, racist and irrational numbers, which is a real property of numbers, that was a bad thing because it stigmatized people who had mental health disorder. And I just went through a whole thing. I would meet professors of mathematics at conferences, and they'd say, we sit there and watch that clip and laugh together, and it turns out that you were right. Well, the reason why I turn out to be right with my prophetic satire is because all I'm doing is that I simply take the lunacy and I extrapolate it to its boundary condition. Well, what could be more insane than to argue that something as invariant as mathematics, that by definition cannot be influenced by your biases, is itself a form of white supremacy, and therefore I target my satire there. So having said that, I'm not saying this to be all, to toot my horn, but if you have that capacity to see that satire going to endless forms of lunacy, does that make us pessimistic that we're never going to get out of the abyss of lunacy? Or can you give us any hope that we can wrestle back reason from this insanity?
I think that wokeness came to college campuses first. So you saw the beta testing of the wokeness. And at least it's only happening in math and not like in any subject that we actually use, right? But once it came to college campuses, we were told, oh, this is only happening in college campuses. Like once these kids get into the real world, what ended up happening was they got into the real world, they changed all the corporations and institutions, and now they're really leading the way with this ideology in so many different areas of our lives. The hopeful thing that I like to say is that their ideas are really unpopular, and that's why they have to do it by force. That's why they need us to conform. If the ideas were well liked and everybody loved it, when we talk about math being racist, everybody would be like, yeah, math is racist. Clearly. I mean, I think it's racist. I'm really bad at math. So I think math is anti-Semitic. I don't, it's not for me. But I think that the pendulum will swing back the other way, but beyond just waiting for that to happen, people need to realize that sanity is in the majority. Like this woke virus is a very small part of the population. In the US, only 7% of people identify as very liberal. And that, probably even smaller number would consider themselves progressive or woke. And so when you argue with these people, you have to know that you have, the 93% behind you. It's just, you have to be brave and you have to stand up to their ability to call you racist and sexist and all these different names and shut down your speech when they don't like it, and make you conform to what they're saying and make you say things in the exact right way and make a spectacle of it, just like totalitarian societies did in the past. So people need to stand up and they need to be brave and they need to know that they are the majority.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bethany.
Sorry, just to piggyback on Karol just for a second, the other way that they achieve this is in secrecy. And so they know that their ideas are not popular, and that's why they're indoctrinating our children in secret. It's why Disney executives are having conversations about how to make, how to make Disney more woke and more, all of these things on their Zoom calls, sort of in secret, but they're not smart enough to sort of limit the number of people who are watching, because that was sort of an all staff conversation. Right. But they know that they have to do this in secret because this is not a popular ideology. And so much of our book is just shining a light on that. And folks need to pay attention. A lot of what they're doing is not secret enough. They're not very good at keeping secrets because they're not very smart. And so you just kind of have to pay attention and shine a light on it also. And people should, touch base with other folks in their social circles who agree that this is crazy and that this is a real threat. And, bring it to the attention of other parents and bring it to the attention of local activists who are, I think that a lot of the activists are moms because they might not necessarily be the breadwinners of the family, and so they don't have as much to lose if they get canceled. So, throw some moms under the bus. Why not? That's why we're here, right?
Go ahead, finish your point.
No, I mean that's just, moms are here to take the hits. So here we are.
So you said, for people to get together, which is a nice segue to my next question. Are there any upcoming or ones that recently started grassroots organizations that are sort of anti-woke parent chapters? So, for example, in academia, although some of these attempts have not been very successful, there have been sort of a coming together of like-minded professors who don't like all of these idiotic ideas. You know, the heterodox academy. I would argue that it's not nearly as effective as it could have been. But still, there is an attempt to ban people so that we can find each other. Are there such organizations for parents who are anti-woke, or if not, wouldn't that be a great idea to do that?
There are. I would say that the biggest problem is that it's hard to get people to care when they don't have their own kids, or when their kids are no longer of the age where this is affecting them, or if their kids are too young to be affected. You know, I was thinking that the last time that I was on your show, we ended up talking about sex, and it was like, you know, a popular clip. And it's harder to get people to care about, like, oh, but your children are being targeted. It's just not quite as, I don't want to use the word sexy when I'm talking about kids, but it's not quite as sexy a topic. And so, like, you mentioned Asra Nomani earlier, her child missed out on getting a National Merit Scholarship because the school in Virginia didn't want too many white and Asian kids to get it. And so they didn't tell them that they qualified for the scholarship. Travesty. The problem is not that many people have kids who will qualify for that scholarship. So getting them to care, why should I care? But other people, it's a little bit of a step. But you know, the argument that we make is that it's not just about the children. The children are just sort of like the base that these people are laying. If you don't like doing, you know, the diversity and inclusion, you know, shows at your job, if you don't like the fact that the National Merit Scholarship winner, losers will, you know, go on to like hold you back at your work as well. You have to look at it as it affects all of our society. So there are groups, it's just keeping people engaged even beyond when it doesn't no longer affect them directly is I think the overarching problem with this movement.
Got you.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Beth.
Parents Defending Education, if I'm just going to throw out some
Fantastic.
names. Parents,
I'm on the board. I just want
to say it again. Parents Defending Education.
Yep, Parents Defending Education, and also Moms for Liberty. So I'm just going to throw two names out there. Those are two wonderful groups.
So Moms for Liberty speaks to my earlier comment about the evolutionary reasons why moms might be more likely to be the mama bears than papa bears. So that's exactly right. We don't seem to have dads for liberty when it comes to parental care, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny.
Their dads were members, but yeah.
Right.
So Jennifer Say, who famously got fired from her job at Levi's.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. I just met her. Remember, Karol, I told you that I would be in Palm Beach this last weekend. You'd be in Colorado. That she was one of the speakers. So
oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
So she recently said that she had been approached by a lot of dads who were like, "Thank you for fighting. I can't sacrifice my family's livelihood." And she's like, Do you think that I was volunteering for Levi's?
Right.
I too lost my livelihood. But she that was sort of an interesting anecdote that she said that the number of dads who came up to her and said, "I didn't fight because I was afraid of sort of sacrificing my livelihood." I think there's a lot of evolutionary stuff at play.
Yeah.
And I think the dad provider thing, first of all, it's backed up by data. Dads make more money and moms work less to sort of take on more childcare duties. That's not because we live in an inherently sexist society. It's just biologically what moms want to do and what dads want to do. But I think that there is a biological sort of imperative on the part of men to say, we need to guard our livelihood first and foremost. And moms say the top priority in my brain is our children. And so I think that's also why
you're going to be James. You're going to be James Damord soon. You remember? Who
I know.
You are.
I do. Google.
Nazi stuff.
I know. It's called evolution. It's called evolutionary science. In this family, we believe in science.
There you go. Okay. Are there any? I mean, maybe we don't want to talk about future projects while you're promoting this wonderful book.
Karol, are we ever writing a book again?
I'm never writing a book again.
Is that true?
Well, how long was it between your two books?
So the latest two, because I have many, but you mean the Parasitic Mind, the next one?
The last one.
It's so funny because I was walking with my wife earlier today to go get a coffee, and she said, "Please take a break once the next," because I'm just like a constant busy beaver. So I think probably 4 months into Parasitic Mind being released, I had gotten the contract for the next book and started working on it. So
I'm not
apparently
doing
you're not
that.
going to be doing that. No. Why was it somehow or
I really love the end product, and I'm really proud of this book. I think that we hit everything that we wanted to hit in it. I think we wrote the book that we wanted to write, and we had some challenges along the way, which we have a piece coming out about it, how publishing companies were really skittish about our book, and it was just I just found I'm a columnist. I really enjoy making my point in 700 to 1,000 words,
right?
And that's it,
It's a very different.
And really just and getting the acclaim right away. Like I write it on Thursday, it runs on Friday, and then I really enjoy that process. And the book was just I was like, did I say this already? And the whole like is this original idea? And just all kinds of things that I think I never worry about in my column writing, I suddenly worried about in book writing. So it felt very childbirthy. So people do forget about childbirth.
Yeah, and we're in transition right now.
Kids.
We're in transition.
It's funny that you said childbirth, because so this is my first book right here. The Evolutionary Basis of Consumption came out in 2007. This is an academic book, so like very technical book. When I finished it, I went through something akin to a postpartum depression. But I mean, I'm being a bit hyperbolic, so I didn't literally have clinical depression, but I felt as though I had done this whole big thing, this massive baby had come out of me, and now what do I do with myself? There's nothing I can do that's as big. So I didn't quite feel it with future books, because at that point I had been popping out a lot of babies.
So you had more babies.
I had more babies, but the first one was like, can I ever do something as meaningful as this? Because it was an academic book, it certainly wasn't expected to sell millions of copies. The academic books, if they sell 300 copies, they're considered successful. And so mine had broken through the 1,000 copies. So it was an academic bestseller. But again, compared to a trade book, I could sell that in an afternoon, right? In the trade market. So it was something unique. I did feel a bit of the sort of postpartum depression. How was the collaboration? Are you still very good friends, or less so?
Yeah, no, that part went great. We divided up the chapters along really natural lines. Like there was no like, oh, I should write that, or you should. It just really fit. And we had been talking about doing a book together for a while, so this was really just somewhere that we knew we were going together.
Wonderful. I know that you have a hard stop. Your publicist told me so I'm going to end it. Please stay on the line so we could say goodbye offline. Remember, again, folks, I know the title is Stolen Youth, but I wanted to also say the subtitle, Stolen Youth, How Radicals Are Erasing Innocence and Indoctrinating a Generation, will be out March 7th. Thank you for putting it up. Bethany, ladies, such a pleasure to chat with you. Please come back anytime that you'd like to.
Thank you.
Cheers,
Thank
guys.
you.
Cheers.